It's the Kick and Snare podcast. Let's count it off. Welcome to Kick and Snare. My guest today is Richard James Burgess. Richard is president and CEO of A2IM, which is the American Association of Independent Music. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. I'm honored, and I love the title of your podcast. And you had me at Kick and Snare.
Thank you for that. Drummers need to stick together. I knew it would be code to some of us, so that's cool.
We're done.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I think you have to get about 4 or 5 of us together to get a complete brain, according to the way most people look at drummers.
We'll do a separate episode on the drummer jokes. We've heard them all.
Yeah, I have more down. Believe me, it's
Same here. Well, honestly, I'm looking forward to this one, and I hope we have enough time to cover everything that I'd like to. I have a lot of topics in mind, but I want to make sure we keep it tight and listenable for everybody. So I'll outline what I'd like to discuss, and then let's see where it goes. So first, I want to cover A2IM, its work on behalf of independent labels and artists, and we should get into that in depth. Second, I want to learn more about some of the members of the organization. So if you're in a position to highlight some of the work that they're doing and how they're interacting with the organization, that would be great. And then third, I want to save some time to learn more about you, because you have this fascinating, and as we discussed in an earlier conversation, squiggly career, which is a phrase I picked up from Matt Cartmel at Music Tech UK when we were talking about people who have had diverse career paths. Sometimes they don't look like paths; they look like they've been wandering, but they're often very meaningful despite that. So that's what I'd like to get into today.
Yeah, I think my career is more like sort of when you blow up a balloon and then you let go of it before you tie it off, you know.
That's a great metaphor here.
But,
I can picture that. Yes.
Yeah. I also think my career is a precursor to what everybody's careers are going to look like in the future.
That's a really good point. And before we jump in, that's a really interesting point because I think that's true. The idea of the single linear career path really is over for many. I still hope there are people who always want to be doctors and will become doctors and be successful and stay in that career. But even folks who become attorneys and otherwise find themselves exploring new things and new interests and jumping off in a variety of different directions. So that seems to be the future.
I think a lot of people are treating their education and their initial sort of career path choices as a platform to go on and do bigger and better things. And not everybody. I mean, I'm in awe of people who are able to do one thing their whole career. For me, it just isn't the way my mind works, to be honest with you. That's the problem.
I get that. Well, to keep us both on track, to make sure we talk about the topics at hand, tell me about A2IM. I want to understand the primary mission and how it aligns with the needs of its members, independent labels and artists. And I understand there's some other types of members. We can get into that as you wish. It might be good for us to define what we mean by independent in this case, and that might be a good place to start. So, yeah, I mean, I lay that at your feet.
Independent is not complicated as I see it. Basically, it's if you own more than 50%, if you have control of your company, could be 50.1%, whatever, of your copyrights, then you are independent as far as we're concerned as a record label. And I see it the same way with publishing as well. Many of our members own 100% of their copyrights, but it gets way complicated because it depends who actually invests in the company. I mean, the company may own 100% of the copyrights, but then the company might be funded by private equity, or they may have major label investment even. But if it doesn't exceed 50%, the company can move its distribution and go somewhere else with their copyrights. If they can sell their company and then without having to consult people who earn more than they do, then you're independent. So I don't see it as being so complicated. And I keep hearing a lot of people talk about, independence really changing. It's not. It's always been a diverse division. I think what's exacerbated that sort of feeling and that discussion is that DIY has now become like an overwhelming segment. You've got 120,000 tracks a day being uploaded to DSPs.
Right.
And so I think that makes people feel like, well, can you compare a DIY label to, say, Big Machine or, Beggars or Concord or something like that? Well, obviously you can't, but that diversity has always existed. So I think what you have is just have diverse range of independent labels, but they are all independent in the same way, in that they own their own copyrights.
Understood. Thank you for that. That's helpful. And it's an interesting thing too, because implicit in what you're saying is that there are potentially different needs that each of those two groups might have, but probably some overlap as well, I would imagine, just sort of intuitively. So I'm curious more about the mission and how it works for members in general.
Yeah, so the mission started out in 2005, 20 years ago. And really the objective was to level the playing field, because the feeling at the time, to put it in context, we were a little more than 5 years into the digital disruption. Napster had launched in 1999 and caught the music industry flat-footed. I blame the music industry, to be honest with you, not Napster. I mean, it's like nature abhors a vacuum. And what happened was, as I say in my last book, MP3s were invented in 88. The first MP3 players were on the market in 1997. And by 1999, the music industry had not done anything substantive to address the digital delivery of music. Now, the independents, Sub Pop, for instance, had put out recordings as MP3s. And but really, as an industry as a whole, we hadn't done anything substantive. And the majors at the time were in charge of distribution. They were the distribution channels. There were some independent distributors at the time, some of the same ones that are independent today. Like I had an independent label in 96, 97. It was distributed by Red Eye and The Orchard, when The Orchard was not part of Sony. The Orchard still distributes independent labels, as does Red Eye. And so, the options were all still available back then. I think we should have done something about digital, and we didn't. But then, of course, we waited and we waited until Apple finally, they put out the iPod, then they set up iTunes, and Jobs agreed the $1 per download track. He unbundled the album, and we're still sort of living with the consequences of that. And the decision to give 70% of the revenue to the DSPs, which I think was completely crazy, because it's a near zero marginal cost transaction. But the industry didn't understand that. And I keep hearing people in the industry say to me, well, that's comparable to, what it was in the physical days. I go, yeah, but sending a digital file across the internet is not comparable to pressing a vinyl album or a CD and sticking it in a cover or putting it in a jewel case or whatever, and shrink wrapping it, putting it in boxes, putting it on trucks, sending it across the country. And so we're paying 30% for the same, for the pleasure of firing some electrons across the internet. I don't think so. I think that's crazy. But that ship sailed. We're not going to change that anytime soon. So, but when A2IM came along, I don't know if you recall this, but Apple suddenly decided they were just going to pay the independents 65 cents instead of 70, and the majors were getting 70. And this was a big furor. And that sort of was a major motivation to getting the independent sector together, to kind of make sure that these kinds of things didn't happen. And that's still what we're doing, really. I mean, that situation got resolved at the time. A lot of people got involved. A lot of people took credit for it. But A2IM was definitely a big part of solving that problem. And that really launched the organization. We had Don Rose was president then Rich Bengloff took over from Don. Molly Newman took over for about 6 months in between Rich and me, but she didn't actually want the job, so they wound up picking me. And I've been here for 10 years now. So we're still fighting the same fight, trying to get a level playing field. I mean, sometimes now it's not even about trying to get a level playing field. between the independents and the majors anymore. Sometimes it's more about, can the independents and the majors get a fair deal, like the TikTok thing that just happened. You know, there's no universe in which you can say that TikTok pays music creators fairly. They don't. It's appalling what they pay. Um, we had one label say they got something like $200 for something like 600 billion streams. Now, TikTok doesn't pay by streams; they pay by videos created. But you know, who thought that was a good idea? Um, so these are the kinds of things we deal with on a daily basis.
Got it. So that explains how the missions evolved some. Certainly, it's a very current problem with TikTok, and a little different than what we were dealing with at the beginning of digital distribution. So that's interesting. So in some ways, you've pointed out that at least some of the challenges of independent artists and independent labels overlaps with that of a major in this case, or with all the majors. That relationship between independents and majors has been fraught at times. If maybe I'm being too polite to say it that way, or maybe not polite enough. Can you speak to that? Because it's interesting how the relationship can be collaborative and positive, but not always. So tell us more about that.
I think, it's probably not that much different than familial relationships. It's just kind of, there are many situations under which we have exactly the same interests. And, we meet with the majors all the time. We're very close with the RAAA. We're close with the NMPA, the publisher side.
Sure.
I've always described, ever since I've been in this job, but I felt this way my whole life, the music industry is an ecosystem. And, at the base of the ecosystem is the musicians, the writers, and the people that create the music. If we don't have the creators of music, then we don't have an industry. We don't have a base on which to build an industry. But then the publishers and the labels, they have separate interests, but in many ways common interests. If payments are reduced for any reason from any sort of form of delivery, it sometimes affects the publishers, sometimes affects the labels, and sometimes it affects both of us. So I'm a big fan of we're all in it together. And basically our sort of North Star, if you like, is that we want to see more of the value of copyrights returned to the people that create those copyrights and the people that invest in the creation of those copyrights, which will be the labels and the publishers. And so that's it's pretty simple as far as I'm concerned. So many times we're standing shoulder to shoulder with the majors, and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we have a different perspective. Usually it's a perspective of scale between the independents and the majors. What works at the scale that a Universal Music Group or Sony Music operates at doesn't necessarily work at the scale of a 3 or 4 person independent label. It might be a very successful independent label. But, the whole cost relationship is completely different.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And it's encouraging as well. So thank you for sharing that. Is there something that people get wrong? You may have touched on this already in what you just said, but is there a misconception that the public has about the independent music community or about labels?
Well, one misconception is that independent means small. It's a kind of an out of date statistic at this point, but and I do have an in date statistic. But when I first took this job, Adele and Taylor Swift were both on independent labels,
Right.
so they were at the time the biggest artists in the world. And, they're still up there now. But last year, Shabuzi, which is on Empire, one of our members, an independent label and distributor, and was actually the biggest selling record of the year, bar none. There were no major label record sold more than Shabuzi's record. So, it can be small as well. So, we have very, very niche labels. We have reggae labels, and we have, labels that have 1 or 2 employees, So what's great about the independent sector is that diversity, and it's diversity in all respects. It can be ethnic, it can be gender, it can be genre, it can be location, geography, and that's an amazing thing. But the thing I like about the independents is they tend to be more driven by their intuitive sort of likes and dislikes. So, just to put sort of a fine point on that, I like to point out that if you can think of a genre of music that is quintessentially American, it came from an independent label. And that would be, just to name a few, jazz, blues, country, gospel, jump jive, bebop, rock and roll, doo-wop, hip hop, house, electronic. It all came out of the independent sector. And then once it's successful, the majors tend to pick up on it. And, but I like to say, it's like the law of inertia. It's a lot harder to get something from 0 to 30 than it is to get it from 30 to 60. So it's the independents do the heavy lift of getting the thing moving in the first place.
Right. So they're essentially akin to innovators and startups within larger business communities in that regard. They have to have the passion and the hard work to make it go. Yeah,
I think, honestly believe if the independent sector didn't exist, a lot of genres would not exist. Like, I'm not sure that hip hop ever would have become what it did if it wasn't for the independents. Because it had to get started somewhere, and the majors just didn't get it. And it was risky, because there were copyright issues with early hip hop in particular. Sure. And since, the basis of hip hop is taking, samples from records, basically. I mean, before there was even sampling, they used to spin things in from records. And there was nothing legal about that. But fortunately, the independents turned a blind eye to it, and it got established. And then there was a whole sort of sample licensing regime that, grew up around it. Mm-hmm. And, that's how it works. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful
Sometimes you have
cycle.
to, color outside the lines sometimes to make things happen.
I'm
that's
a big
cool.
fan.
Yeah, I'm with you.
I was never good at staying within the lines.
That'll be the pull quote for this episode for sure.
Yeah,
definitely. So let's talk more about the issues that that A2IM has taken on for its members. So, for example, I read with some interest about working with Billboard to modify the inclusion parameters, I guess is the right word, for the independent albums chart. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, we have constant meetings with Luminate and Billboard, and they're great partners, I have to say. I mean, they've been very responsive, and mostly it's a question of just sort of explaining what our concerns are, and I can use an example that is not, it doesn't involve Billboard or Luminate, but there was some there was a U.S. Copyright Office paper decision to sort of review the whole copyright registration process, and we collaborated with the majors on this, and the majors were okay with a doubling of the charge, and we weren't, because for them it wasn't that big of a deal because of the scale at which they operate. But for the independents, it would be a big deal to double the charge for registering a copyright. So, but just in the discussion with the majors, they agreed, and they saw our point. I'm sure they didn't want to pay double either, but when they saw that it was actually really oppressive for us, they went along with it. So, we have that kind of interaction with Billboard and Luminate as well. They've definitely made an attempt to try to understand what our issues are, and we've made an attempt to try to explain to them. We're not trying to sort of jack the charts at all. We're just trying to sort of make sure that we have an equal shot at the chances. So it's been good. I'm really, really happy. That's probably one of my most successful working groups is the chart, physical and now digital chart discussions.
Are there other efforts that stand out for you? I made note of the safe harbor provisions in DMCA, for example. Is that worth talking about?
I mean, that's a constant frustration, honestly. That was sort of like a last-minute thing that got thrown into the DMCA back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I was actually there when that was being done. I was not in this position. I was actually working at Smithsonian, but I just was always interested in the whole, legislative process and everything. And it was thrown in to protect the likes of AOL and CompuServe that existed at the time, right. the ISPs. Yeah. And nobody really, there was no digital distribution at the time, and there was certainly no UGC. So it was not, that protection was not, safe harbor protection was not put in with any kind of understanding of what the environment looks like now. And it's unfortunate. I did a survey of the independent sector quite a few years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago probably. And it turned out that at that time, 62% of independent labels just didn't even bother with notice and takedown, which is the mechanism by which you have to notify someone that the DSP that someone's infringing on your work. And I find that pretty disappointing, really. It's there's an awful lot of infringement going on, and nobody does. It's short of taking someone to court. There isn't much you can do about it. Now, when it's really high profile, and there are a couple of high profile cases going on right now, then you have to take them to court. And I'm a big believer in that.
Makes sense. So it sounds like to some degree, as things become more complicated, managed digitally, rights and payments and otherwise are happening in a digital realm now. Doesn't mean it wasn't difficult in the past when you had to audit paper and things like that. But is that one of the challenges facing independent labels these days, the sort of flow of dollars through the ecosystem?
It's way more complicated than it used to be. I mean, you used to, you'd press up a piece of vinyl, you'd stick it in the cover and send it out to a store. Someone would walk in and slap the cash down on the counter and they'd account for it and you'd get paid. I mean, there was always, one of my favorite words, jiggery pokery went on in the process. So, there was always, little ways that money went missing in the, in the flow, as it were, little diversions along the way. But these days, it's aside from the little diversions that still happen, the intentional diversions, there are also sort of unintentional diversions or semi-intentional diversions because it's so complicated now. You'd be amazed at how many people in this industry don't really understand how many streams of revenue there are and how you have to access each one of them. And so there's a lot of money being left on the table right now, and that does disturb me. Having said that, I think it's great that there are all these channels and these streams of revenue. I wish they were bigger, but they do add up.
Sure. That makes sense. And in the aggregate, I imagine they can be hugely valuable.
They can. Yeah.
Does A2IM help members in that regard? Are you, educating them on how to cobble together these?
Very much so. That's, we say we do advocacy, education, networking or connection, and that's a big part of what we do. And so, I mean, we're at the end of a phone or email or text or whatever all the time for anybody who's got a specific question. But then when we do webinars on almost a weekly basis. We do Indie Week, which is coming up in 2 weeks, and Libera Awards, which that isn't so much educating people, but it kind of does, because when I joined back in 2005, the thing I loved about it, and I was living down in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I used to take the train up just to the mixes. Part of the reason was because, I would just learn a lot just talking to other people, So, I'd figure something out, and you'd run it by someone and figure out that they either did it a different way or they did it the same way. So it was confirming that you figured it out correctly, So, you've got the networking is also education, but the education's, the panels we do, the webinars we do, those kinds of things. And it's never-endingly complicated. I mean, I would have thought by now we would have figured it all out, but there's always something that's changing. The DSPs are always introducing new business models, new ways of promoting things. It's not necessarily just about cash flow. It's also about how you create that cash flow, but through your marketing techniques and those kinds of things. So, yeah, I mean, I that's a huge part of what we do.
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around playlisting and how that works across the industry.
When you figure it out, give me a call.
Yeah. I'd be happy to help if I could. But don't expect that call, at least not on that topic.
Well, the good news is it doesn't account for a great deal of the revenue that's being generated.
Okay, good. That's reassuring. So certainly AI is a topic that it would be remiss for me not to touch on, but we don't really have enough time to go in depth and certainly broad enough on the topic. But is it a bigger effect? Is it a bigger problem for independent labels versus majors right now? Does that fall? Is that the right way to ask the question? I guess I worry about and wonder about what the effect of AI technologies is for those in your category in the independent sector.
Right now, I'd say it's about the same size problem for us as it is for the majors. I think, the question is what happens over the next year or so, and we're in it together. We're part of the Human Artistry campaign. We're on those calls. We're in that coalition. I think we're on the same page as it stands right now. You got two primary issues. One is the licensing of the creative work for use for training.
For training, right.
And that unequivocally, we're on the same page there. We believe that needs to be licensed.
Sure.
The question is, what's the mechanism for that licensing? I think the independents and the majors both believe that a private licensing, direct licensing system is the best system. I think they think that they will get the most out of it. Other people have postulated that it should be some form of collective license or some form of statutory compulsory license. Right now, I don't think that's the direction the majors are going in, or the independents. But then you've got the output, which is the work that comes out, and that's a lot of what the Suno and Udio case is about right now. That the majors are pursuing, and it's about the fact that the outputs, they obviously use copyrighted material to train their AIs on, and the outputs are coming out sounding somewhat similar to some artists that are under contract and that own their copyrights and their rights to everything. You've got the name, image, and likeness issue, which we've been a part of. I mean, we were a part of the coalition that got the Elvis Act passed in Tennessee, and that was a precursor to a federal bill that would say basically the same things, just more difficult to get a federal bill than it was to get one in Tennessee. Right. And there were some other good ones around the country as well. Ideally, we would prefer it to be controlled federally and not by a patchwork quilt of state bills. That's never ideal. But I think we're on the same page with the majors right now. There is always the potential for a divergence of interest. Again, mainly because of the influence of scale. Scale can really make a very big difference in whether something works or whether it doesn't work.
Understood. So shifting gears a little bit, A2IM provides some direct support to its members that sits outside of the topics that we've been talking about. I'm thinking about, for example, the Artist Pro program, which supports the well-being of artist members, or independent label members. Can you tell us more about how that came about and what's included and why it's a good thing?
So I mentioned before that I've always seen the music industry as an ecosystem. And it starts, you could go back to when I started playing. You start out playing, in your front room or in your garage or whatever, and hopefully you play the local youth club or whatever, church hall, and whatever your particular, route to getting out into the public is. Sure. And then eventually, you used to hope to make a recording. Now it's slightly different because people often start out with a recording and don't start out going out and playing live.
Right.
But, almost without exception. I think I can go that broad. Everybody starts out as a DIY artist in some way. You're either playing a gig, playing at school, or you're making a record on your mother's laptop or whatever you're doing, or on your phone. I've heard some amazing things done on people's phones, by the way.
Indeed.
And so, and then that DIY artist sometimes gets picked up by a major immediately. That doesn't happen very often. We can name several instances when it did happen. But very often they go to a small independent label. Sometimes they form an independent label. Sometimes that label becomes a full-on label where they have many other acts. And then sometimes that artist, they'll do 2 or 3 albums with an independent label and then get picked up by either a bigger independent or a major. So, the whole thing works together, So I think that but the layer that I feel like is most vulnerable is the artist layer. And although we represent labels, I think the independents are a lot closer to that artist layer than the majors are. Not that the majors don't take care of their artists. I think certainly the ones that are successful, they do.
Sure.
But the independents tend to allow more creative control than the majors do. You're unlikely to get signed to a major and be given carte blanche, whereas on an independent, that happens a lot. So, if we can take care of that artist layer, just get them through those first stages of their career, then, you've got a much more sort of vibrant crop, as it were, that can be transplanted into the independent sector and hopefully stay in the independent sector. But if not, ultimately into the major label portion of the industry. So, so we also, with our Artist Pro division, we offer health insurance. They have to pay for it in addition to belonging to the Artist Pro division. But we were able to negotiate pretty competitive healthcare program for independent contractors, artists, and it's very hard. I was an artist myself, and it's
Sure.
extremely hard in this country to get healthcare if you don't have a full-time job, basically.
Yep. That's got to be a high value thing. What sort of response have you seen to the program? Particularly curious about the health insurance and life insurance and things like that.
Not a gigantic tsunami like I would have expected, but on the other hand, when I think about it, first off, it's solid. It's growing all the time. But the way the healthcare system works is, you're pretty vulnerable in this country if you don't have healthcare. And so it takes a while for people to sort of be able to change. You
Sure.
get that sort of period in November whenever they, you've got a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is to change.
Right. The open enrollment or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So, you might have to wait a year before somebody can actually join. So, but it's growing gradually. I'm very glad we did it. I mean, we make no money from that, by the way. It was just a sort of this needs to be done. And
that's a good service.
I hate to think that somebody doesn't become an artist or an entrepreneur because they don't have health care. And I have seen that happen. People, they either don't do it or they compromise their ability to do it by having to hold down a job that does give them health care while they're trying to develop their business or their music career. And I because I don't come from this country and I love this country, it's why I live here. But I'm always been puzzled why what I would consider to be the most entrepreneurial country in the world has decided to tie its healthcare system to having a full-time job, which is the least entrepreneurial thing you can do.
Agreed. So, it's a mystery to me as well, and and frustrating.
And it's funny because it's become I think it gets tired with this kind of socialist brush or something like that, but actually it would be the most capitalist thing we could do to make healthcare available to everybody, because you would have a lot more entrepreneurs, a lot more artists.
I agree. And if you think about wanting to inspire people who are innovators and risk takers and otherwise, usually that happens when people are young. And when they're young, they also don't recognize the need for healthcare as acutely as they, or as insurance for healthcare as they would when they're older. And so it's a challenge. I think a lot of people probably put it off and, hope for the best, especially earlier in their careers. If they are going to be entrepreneurial, it's, well, I'm young, I'm healthy. I don't need this right now, until something bad happens. And then it can be disastrous.
You're young and you're healthy until you get thrown off your bike or, get
right.
something. And, it's true. But it's a dangerous thing, to run without healthcare.
Right. So you're coming to the end of a 10-year, this is going to sound strange, a 10-year tenure at A2IM. And today, as I understand it, and first of all, congratulations. That's a pretty amazing run. I should start with that. Let me not skip over that. Pause on that thought for a minute. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I think, as I understand it, you're about more than 550 labels and members today. Is that right? Help me understand the numbers and how that's grown over the time that you're there.
We're in that range. Yeah, I mean, it's tricky how you count it, because you could count it as tens of thousands of labels if you included all the what we call child labels. So we have, I mean, almost all of our labels have more than one label under them. We don't tend to count the child labels. If we did, we'd be in the tens of thousands. But yeah, I mean, about 550, parent labels that pay dues to A2IM. That's how we look at it.
Got it. And so how did that growth been linear? Has it accelerated? Help me understand, what the trends are.
Well, I mean, like I say, because of the way you count, it's difficult to tell when you look back. But let's put it this way: our revenue is significantly higher than it was 10 years ago, and we haven't increased our dues at all. We haven't we haven't changed the dues formula since 2005, and it's based on revenues. So it's a I think that's the best way. That's the way I look at it, because we tried all kinds of things. Especially because we have membership people, and sort of like, how do you sort of reward a membership person, or how do you kind of, acknowledge that they're doing a great job? Well, if you count the labels, then they'll sign, somebody that has 50 sub labels. Right.
They wouldn't do that. Come on.
No. Well, I always like Charlie Munger's. I think it was Charlie Munger who said, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome."
Right. It's true. You got to align the incentives for success. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't trying to back into the revenue picture. So please don't misunderstand the question. It just seems over this 10-year period, you've been there, from, early stages to, a fairly well, grown and advanced organization, which is great.
No, I'll say it. I mean, the revenue is the most essential thing. I mean, you can't. Yeah, we were just talking about it this morning. It's like the oxygen mask thing. If you don't have members and you don't have revenue, then you don't have a trade association. So, as high-minded as these organizations are, I mean, and the fact that we're not for profit, but we get no support. We have no financial support from the government whatsoever. And by the way, most other trade associations around the world do get financial support from the government. But this is. It's a very different. In some ways, it's great. The fact that we're completely, we're not bound to anybody else's rules other than the bylaws of the organization and what the board wants and what the members want.
Right. Well, I guess if you had too much support from the government, it would be socialism, unless you're a major corporation.
Well, that's right.
In which case you'd have to go, and no, we won't go there. There's challenges in any model, but I think the independence makes sense here. You're free to advocate for what you believe in and for the interests of your members, and not have to play politics otherwise, which is great.
No, I like that. I mean, it definitely can compromise you taking government money. There's no question about that.
Yeah. So it's very hard. I've never been a big fan of, 5-year, 10-year plans and things like that. I've certainly never had one for myself. And even businesses I've worked in who've tried to articulate those have found it increasingly difficult, as the pace of innovation and change in business is accelerating all the time. But as you come to the end of this great run, and as I understand it, it'll for 2026 will be the end for you. Mm-hmm. In this particular role, let me be clear. And is it fair to ask, what would be the sort of critical things for your successor to prioritize in the next 2, 5, 10 years, whatever horizon you think is worth talking about? Or is it a ridiculous question? I'm not sure.
No, it's not a ridiculous question. I think though, one of the reasons why I'm stepping down, one of the reasons why I wanted to resign at 10 years, and I decided that before I took the job, I was only going to go 10 years. Max. I mean, they might have decided to jettison me after 2 or 3, but I because you get to a certain point where it's really hard to see what you're doing with fresh eyes. One of the things I looked at over the years I've been here was, what would I do if I was trying to disrupt A2IM, if I was trying to, come into this business and change the way it worked, and say, well, I don't think A2IM is doing a very good job. How would I approach that? And I think I've kind of we've come up with a lot of things over the years, a lot of different ways of approaching that. And but I think it's really up to the next person. You know, I built. I mean, I feel like I stood on the shoulders of giants, on Marley, Rich, Don's shoulders. You know, I inherited a healthy organization. It was a lot smaller than it is now, and so my vision was to scale it, and my vision was to really expand our lobbying advocacy capabilities, and I believe I've done that. But I think it's up to the next person coming in. You know, I'm trying not to bias things. I mean, one thing, we just had the board elections. I was adamant that we really needed the strongest possible board in the transition period. So the new board takes, we replace 3 or 4 people every year. This year it was 4, and I think the board going forward is really, really strong. I think we've had strong boards the whole time I've been here, but this is a very strong board, and I'm happy about that, because whoever comes in, depending what their experience is and how much they know about it, how much they've been involved with the organization, they're going to need varying amounts of support. I was fortunate in that I was on the board for 2.5 years before I took this job, and I was chairman of the board for the 6 months prior to taking the job. So I had a fairly deep understanding of how the organization worked and what the particular issues were. But the first day I sat in this chair, it was very different. You know, I saw things with a very different perspective. So my goal really in the transition is to leave a healthy organization with all avenues open to the new CEO, president, whatever they want to call the person who takes the job. And I'd be really interested to see where it goes. I have no desire to control the future after I'm gone. My desire is to hand off a strong organization and believe in the system, believe that the board and the succession committee will pick somebody who is really going to do the right thing by this company.
I'm going to shift gears here because you have worn so many hats, and whoever steps in next at A2IM, it would be impossible to think that they would have your breadth of experience. So, I'm sure they'll be great, anybody who's ever in this role. But you've worn many hats, as I said, musician, recording artist, writer, producer, technologist, author. I don't even know where to begin because you've done so many things and predating your time at A2IM. But I'm eager to understand, more about how you started in music, how you became a recording artist, and then a producer and a manager and all these other things. Like, take us a little bit through the beginning, and then I'll ask some specific questions. I certainly want to ask some specific questions based on some of my research, but go ahead.
Well, I followed my nose, really. I mean, all I ever really wanted to be was a drummer. And, I just was devoted to playing the drums. And, I played in bands and everything. And then I became infatuated with being a studio musician. I just wanted to be a studio musician. And I realized a strange thing pretty early on is if I set my sights on something, I could achieve it. And, I don't know. I never quite understood the mechanism by how that worked, but I realized once I really wanted something and I turned my sort of mental attention towards it, I got there. So I wanted to become a studio musician. I was actually in Australia, working in Australia as a musician, and I moved back to New Zealand. And I was about to go to England, and I got a phone call saying, "Would you like to audition for this band called the Quincy Conserve," which was the top band in New Zealand at the time, and they were the house band for HMV Studios, owned by EMI Records, in Wellington. And I actually thought the person was joking, and I nearly hung up on them, but it turned out to be real. I auditioned for it, and I wound up, spending a year in Wellington playing with this amazing band and doing pretty much all the sessions that were done for EMI over that period of time. And
Fantastic.
then, it was incredible. And then I decided that, New Zealand's a very small market and it's very far from everywhere else. And at the time, it was almost impossible to have an international hit, like Lord, we all know now, but that was impossible before the internet. you had to really move away. Even bands like Split Enz and Crowded House had to move, somewhere else in the world in order to achieve that success.
Right.
So I moved to England, and I was able to pick up my studio career there, and that went really well too. I was playing on, incredible sessions with all the top producers at the time and all the best studios. It was absolutely amazing, like Air Studios and Abbey Road and Whitfield Street. There were so many great studios in London at the time. But then I realized that, the person making the most money in the room was the one on a royalty, and usually the least good musician in the room, the artist. So I thought, well, and I looked ahead and I didn't see a lot of 55-year-old studio musicians. There were some, but they were doing sort of light music and Broadway, like West End and things, which I did also. But that didn't interest me. I never was particularly interested in doing, musicals and things like that. I did it just for the hell of it to see what it was like, but it wasn't my thing. So I sort of set my sights on becoming an artist, and I was able to do that. I had been signed to EMI Records in New Zealand, and then I got signed to Warner Music when I left Berklee. That didn't work out, but then I went through actually 6 major label deals total. I was signed to Polydor, signed to RCA. I wound up back on Capitol. I was CBS at one point. So now they're all compacted down into 3 labels now, but back then there were 6. And that went really, really well. But, and I had hits. I had hits with Landscape, Einstein a Go-Go, Norman Bates. I had hits with, other artists as well, many actually. But people kept sort of being attracted to my producing, and especially because I was a pioneer in the computer music. We made the first record by computer with Landscape and the electronic stuff. And I had always been fascinated by synthesizers. I've been messing around with them, primarily trying to make drum sounds, which is kind of how the Simmons SDS5 electronic drum synthesizer came to be invented. And this was a transition when people were starting to make records by computer and starting to make records using more synthesizers, the beginning of the electronic era. And I had coined the term EDM, which was on the track European Man that Landscape put out. And it actually carries the serial number EDM1. And on the back of the single cover, it says EDM, electronic dance music, computer program to perfection for your listening pleasure. And that was 1980.
And so you coined that phrase. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well,
the acronym, I guess.
I'm also accused of coining the phrase new romantic as well, because I was part of that movement, the Blitz movement. And there's actually there's a London Design Museum exhibit coming up in September on the Blitz movement, which was actually started by a very good friend of mine, Rusty Egan, who I had actually taught to play drums. And he was really what I describe as the sonic architect of the Blitz. And his friend, Steve Strange, was sort of more the visual fashion person. But, and out of that, I wound up producing Spandau Ballet, which wound up that's how I transitioned into producing. And I had been interested in producing for a while. For about 6 months, I sort of thought, well, I should try my hand at producing, because I sort of feel like drummers are a bit like goalkeepers. They see the whole play. Goalkeepers in soccer, everything that's going on the field, and you're standing back there screaming at them what to do. But somehow, we control the dynamics of it. We understand how everything works. And there's a lot of drummers became producers, like Phil Collins did, Marvin Gaye did.
Sure.
There's a huge list of Maurice White. So that was a really easy transition as well. So I really just followed my nose, and to some extent the money, because, it's after a while you're working and you go, well, why am I working for, just a fee when I could be working for a royalty? But actually, when I moved from doing studio work to producing, I took a huge pay cut for the first 6 months or so. But once I had the hits, the royalties started to flow in substantially. So it's a question of whether you want guaranteed money up front or whether you believe in yourself and you're prepared to take a chance on on getting a share of the proceeds, as it were.
Right.
So
Getting into the back end.
yeah,
That's
so that
cool.
was it really. And then I was actually off sick for 3 years. I had a misdiagnosed kidney problem, and when I came back to producing, I produced a couple more hits actually, but it just was a different sort of scene at that point. Now we were into the '90s. I think the A&R people saw me as sort of Mr. '80s, and
Mm.
and I thought, well, I don't really need this. And I found a band when I was on vacation. I was initially just going to produce them and sort of shop them and get them a deal and move on. And then I thought, it'd probably be better if I actually managed them. And by this time, I'd had a number of managers. I'd worked with a ton of managers. I'd had a lot of
You knew what to
experience.
do,
I
right?
did, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I did. And actually, I still manage that band, just like 30 years later, nearly. And then I out of the blue, I got offered the job at Smithsonian Folkways Recordings. And the only reason I took that job was because I had been influenced by Leadbelly as a kid, and they had the
Hmm.
Leadbelly collection. And I thought
Right.
I just have to work with that collection. And
That's
so I
very
wound
cool.
up there for 14 years. I'd also, before I went there, I'd owned my own label, my own booking agency, and a management company. Um, and it was really Smithsonian Folkways that led me into A2IM because I joined A2IM. Smithsonian Folkways joined A2IM in 2005 when A2IM started up, and I got more and more involved, coming to the mixes and then eventually joining the board, eventually becoming the board chairperson. So it's all a sort of happy accident, as it were.
It's a great story. I
Yeah,
just would be remiss not to go back to Berklee for just a minute. So you
yeah,
studied at Berklee in Boston,
yeah.
and you studied with Alan Dawson. And because I'm a drummer and I'm a geek, and some other
Hmm.
drummers may be listening to this as well or watching, um, for those who don't know, Alan Dawson was an accomplished jazz drummer, but also a renowned educator at Berklee.
Yeah.
And if you don't know Alan's name, you will know Vinnie Colaiuta, Steve Smith, Terry Lynn Carrington, Kenwood Denard, just tremendous number of students of Alan's who've gone on to brilliance, if not success, fame, and fortune. So I'm just curious if there's anything to share about that experience before we run out of time, and then I have one or two final questions for you. So I probably need the short version.
Yeah. So, I mean, I went to Berklee because of Alan Dawson. I did not. I just thought I was going to go there and study with Alan Dawson. I didn't realize I was going to do all these other things like learn arranging and composition and everything, which actually changed my life because
Sure.
that helped me with my producing career later. But Alan was remarkable. I mean, he should have been the best known, greatest drummer in the world, but he was kind of a family man, and he lived in Boston. He liked being in Boston. He didn't want to tour. At the point when he would have really established himself, he would have been on the road all the time. And so he taught Tony Williams from Miles Davis Group, who joined Miles Davis when he was 15 or 16, I think it was. And my philosophy of life is always, if I want to learn something, find the person who's absolutely the best at it and just attach yourself to them in some way, shape, or form. Either listen to everything they've done, look at everything they've done, whatever it is you're looking
Sure.
for, and try to get close to them if you can. Try to understand how their mind works.
Makes sense.
The one big thing I would tell you about Alan was, if it was a half-hour lesson once a week, but if you actually asked them a really interesting question, like 3 minutes to the end of the lesson, you'd wind up getting an hour and a half lesson, and there'd be a bunch of really pissed off students standing outside the door when you came out.
That's a critical insight that others can carry forward. I should have mentioned Tony first. He was in my head, but didn't come out of my mouth. But
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
should have been the first one on the list. So for our coda, if you will,
Hmm. Yeah.
thank you for allowing me that artistic license. In a sentence, what advice would you give independent artists, musicians, label folks about building a sustainable career? Like, what's the one pearl that you think you could share in our little bit of time we have left?
Well, I think, I'll borrow a term from the tech world, and I'd say you got to make sure you have product market fit. And that doesn't mean to say that you have to look at everything else that's out there and kind of do something similar.
Mm.
I'm a big fan of the sort of MVP, minimum viable product,
Sure.
and I've always said to bands, don't spend a year in the basement rehearsing. Like, for example, I mean, or same thing if you're making electronic dance music or hip hop or whatever on your computer, don't spend a year building it up. You got to get it out there and watch what the reaction is, and it's how people react to what you do that's really, really important. And I know a lot of artists tend to take a bit of a snooty attitude, like I don't care what people think. But, ultimately, if you don't have an audience, you don't really have a career. So I think that it is important to have a sense of your own direction, for sure. But it's also important to make sure that whatever you're doing it hooks somebody. Frankly, if you can get one person, that's a start. But then that one person's got to turn into 5, it's got to turn into 20, it's got to turn into 100. And if you're going backwards, I managed a band for a brief moment that would put 25 people in a room, the first week, but the next week there'd be 20, and the next week there'd be 16. And I thought the band was great, but there was some ingredient that just didn't appeal to people. And I told them that. I said, you're going to have to figure this out. And they never did. So, they disappeared without trace. But it's really, really important to make sure that you are creating that response in some group of people. It could be a really extreme bunch of outsiders. And I personally believe that the greatest commercial music comes in from the outside. Mm-hmm. It starts way off in the Netherlands of weird, and then eventually comes into the middle. But you still have to get that reaction. You still got to have somebody who's enthusiastic about it.
Sure. So you got to put stuff out there.
Right.
People have to interact with it. You have to gauge the response. Keep going. Yeah.
You got to put yourself out there. Mm-hmm. Songwriting is probably one of the most vulnerable things you can ever do. Sit in the room with someone. And even if you're a solo songwriter, when you first play that song for somebody, unless you're a total egomaniac, it's a pretty nerve-wracking experience.
Oh, I get it. As a sometime songwriter, I have had to really learn to sort of put my ego aside in order to take risks and do the things that, could be painful when people don't react the way you want. My band and I are recording on Friday, in fact, and I hope get to one of the songs that I wrote, and I'll be crushed if we don't, of course, but I'll be even more crushed if people don't like it if we put it out. So, that's part of the risk.
You want to find out way before you do a major release.
We've been playing it out, and people seem to like it, and the band likes it, so hopefully we'll get to it. We'll see how it goes.
That's good.
Yeah, that's just my little. It'll never be commercially viable. That I know. That's not the goal here. But I have to say thank you so much for doing this with me. It was really fun. I learned a lot, and it was just great to have you share your stories. And what else can I say? But thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. So much.
I'll share links to A2IM and some other interesting things so that people can stay in touch and find out more about you and more about A2IM and its mission. And thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me so much, Michael. Thank you.